Welcome to the Minnesota Rovers Tuesday evening presentation. Minnesota Rovers is an outdoors club based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Our members organize trips that range from 1 hour to 2 weeks in Minnesota or further afield. Examples of our activities include hiking, biking, backpacking, skiing, snowshoeing, paddling, and rock climbing. We also organize conservation and trail clearing trips. Our members have experience and skills in many outdoor activities, so if you want to learn a new outdoor activity, we can probably help you. For more information, go to mnrovers.org. Now let's move on to this week's presentation.
Tonight, you're here to hear from Lisa Filter as she tells us about the Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota. Lisa is the External Relations Director at Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota, a role she's been in for 13 years. Here, she oversees communications and member engagement efforts. She holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's degree in natural resources science and management, both from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She is an avid park user. In 2019, she completed her goal of visiting all the state parks in the Passport Club, along with her spouse and child. She has now started for a second go-around and added the hiking club to the goal. Please welcome tonight's speaker, Lisa Filter.
All right. Well, so thank you so much for having me. As Stacy said, my name is Lisa Filter. I work at Parks and Trails Council, and I'm here to talk about our organization tonight. So we are People Saving Special Places. I'm going to give you a quick history of Parks and Trails in Minnesota generally, and then explain where our organization fits in this history, and then share a little bit of our work today. So let's start with a little bit of context. So Minnesota has a very extensive system of state parks and trails. There are 64 state parks. There's 9 state recreation areas and 25 state trails. And each one of these places has a history about how it came to be established and how they expand through land acquisitions. And often this history comes with some challenges of how they came to be. So I'll explore a little bit about some of those histories later on in the presentation. All right, but first let's start about what makes state parks special and how they're different from regional or national parks and trails. So in Minnesota, state parks are created by law and by the legislature. In 1975, Minnesota passed the Outdoor Recreation Act, which codified our state park and trail system, and it gave 3 criteria that state parks have to have in order to be considered or qualify for state park status. And they are, number 1, that it exemplifies a region of our state in an essentially unspoiled or restored condition, or in a condition that will permit restoration in the foreseeable future. Number 2, it has to contain natural resources that are sufficiently diverse and interesting to attract people from across the state. And finally, it has to be large enough to allow for the protection of plants, animals, and other natural elements, while also allowing for a broad range of opportunities for human enjoyment. So, in a nutshell, our state parks are our state's most outstanding natural lands that are managed for the benefit of all Minnesotans, as well as our visitors. And state trails are similar, but different from state parks. So again, they were codified by that 1975 Outdoor Recreation Act, and they have to follow one of 3 criteria. So they have to connect, or they provide a recreational travel route that connects another unit of the outdoor recreation system. So they're connections. Oh, or they could just be a passage through a scenic, historic, or scientific area. Or very broadly, I guess it could just be a commuter transportation route. So state trails kind of have a broad set of qualifications. Most of the state trails are conversions that happen from the railroad lines after they were abandoned. And Parks and Trails Council was actually instrumental in one of the seminal court cases that fought to ensure that railroad lines could be used for this purpose. There was a lawsuit at one point that the neighboring landowners wanted that land to revert to their ownership rather than continuing to be allowed usage for transportation. But luckily, we prevailed, and now there's Minnesota, I think, is one of the premier states for state trails, paved state trails in the nation. All right, so I just wanted to give a little bit more context with a very short history of parks and trails in general. And I'm going to start in 1847. So this is actually the year that the very first public park was established in Birkenhead Park in Liverpool. It has been nominated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for being a major innovation of modern society. So I think we often think that parks are just a given and that we've always had them, but apparently not. So in 1847, very first one, and the nomination for this heritage site states that at a time when most designed landscapes were private estates and therefore not accessible to the public, Birkenhead Park was purpose-built and publicly funded by a local municipal authority for all of its citizens. It subsequently influenced the creation of urban public parks worldwide and changed the way we perceive the form of towns and cities today. All right, so then let's fast forward a few years to 1853. One of those parks that it helped to establish or influence its establishment was in Central Park in New York City. And Central Park is considered the first artificially landscaped public park in the United States. Its creation was launched a city park movement across the United States. And just a couple years after that, Minnesota got its very first public park. It was 1855. Murphy Square in Minneapolis is considered the first public park in the state of Minnesota. And it was actually a protege of the architect of Central Park who helped to design this park and then Minneapolis's whole system of parks in its city. All right, several years after that, in 1872, this is when we first get our first national park, and it's at Yellowstone, and it is 2,000 times the size of Central Park, so quite a lot bigger than Central Park. And in fact, today, Yellowstone is still considered the second largest national park in the lower 48. And I think that just shows that when this idea of parks got started, they really went bold, and maybe they haven't quite lived up to that boldness since then. And it actually took quite a long time after this for national parks to gain traction, or parks, state parks as well. So it wouldn't be for another 18 years before Yosemite was established as the second national park. Okay, so now we come to Minnesota. This is just 1 year after Yosemite was established as the second state park. So in 1891, Minnesota creates Itasca State Park as our very first state park. And it also has the distinction of being the second state park ever established in the United States. So Minnesota is really at the forefront of the state parks movement. I have just a very quick history about the creation of Itasca. And it starts with this quote by Jacob Brower, who says, "No one will ever fully realize how necessarily strenuous were the exertions which finally resulted in establishing Itasca State Park." And I think it's really interesting to think about the struggle that happens to create these places because we tend to take them for granted after they're created and everybody loves them. But to know that getting it established was no easy task. So part of the history of this place starts in 1832, and that's when the Ojibwe leader Oza Windib, who's photoed here, he helped the geographer Henry Schoolcraft to identify a lake here as the source of the Mississippi River. So it was another 50 years that people were questioning whether or not this was true. They questioned the veracity of whether this was the source of the Mississippi River. So in 1889, the Minnesota Historical Society commissioned a land surveyor by the name of Jacob Brower. And he went up there, surveyed the land, and he confirmed that it was indeed the source of the Mississippi River, and it was written into law. But while Brower was up there, he became enthralled by the massive pine trees that were up in the area around Itasca, what is now Itasca. And this was at a time when, all of the pine trees were being cut down. So shortly after he was up there, nearly every large tree in the state had been cut down. It was a huge transformation of the state. And so he saw this and he really wanted to protect the trees. Like the trees were his main impetus for wanting to establish Itasca State Park. He held up Yellowstone as an example for why Minnesota should create our own park system, because Yellowstone was a thriving park at that point. But he really encountered a lot of resistance. Mostly it had to do with these lumber companies, knowing that if the park were established, it would prevent them from logging the rest of the park. He did eventually succeed after a lot of letter writing and, influencing at the Capitol. He eventually succeeded in getting the state park established. And then he ended up working as the very first park commissioner for a number of years. However, when he was the park commissioner, he did so with no pay. And that was part of the legislature's attempt to undermine the state park's success, is by not funding any staff to actually protect the park or to plan for the park. So I think it's another example of how even after you get a park established, you have to still fight for it. You have to still put effort into making sure that it's protected and upholds the ideals of what the state park's creation, put forth. So then finally, I just want to also mention Mary Gibbs, because I think she has a story that builds on this idea of continuing that fight to protect the lands that are established. So she was the daughter of the second park commissioner, and her father died while she was living up there. And I guess partly it was just out of happenstance that there was nobody else around. So she took on this job, which she had been shadowing her father for years doing as the park commissioner. And she became the very first female park commissioner in the nation. So she had a lot of encounters with these lumber companies that were continuing to log in the area, even after it was established as a state park. And there was a famous encounter that she had with one of these logging company workers who went up to her and had a shotgun in hand and was threatening to shoot her if she continued to enforce the laws that would prevent them from logging the park. She succeeded in that effort that day from keeping him from logging, but she was soon replaced by another commissioner shortly thereafter. All right, well, let's fast forward. 1954. This is 63 years after Itasca was created. And at this point, we had 33 state parks that had been created. But this effort to create more state parks had started to stagnate. There were various volunteer friends groups that organized to support individual parks. And some of those leaders were gathering at Itasca State Park and they were discussing the need to have a statewide voice advocating for state parks across the state. At that meeting was Judge Hella. He was the director of Minnesota State Parks, so this man over here, and also Judge C.R. Magny, who was a judge and a conservationist. They, these two men, along with a few other leaders that were there at that time, decided that they would form this organization. It was the Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota. At that time, it was called the Minnesota Council of State Parks, but eventually it had some name changes and became the Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota. So they were quite successful shortly after they formed this organization. In 1960, they recommended that there be a study done about the need for more parks and recreation areas. And that study actually recommended that there be 35 new state parks, which would be more than doubling what was currently in place. They weren't quite successful in getting all of those state parks established at that time, but just 3 years later, they did have the single largest expansion of Minnesota's state park system with 12 new or reauthorized state parks. All right, and let's fast forward another few years. 1967. This is the year that Minnesota established its very first state trail. And here's a photo of it. It's at the Casey Jones State Trail, which is in southwestern Minnesota. It is a state trail that is still not fully completed in terms of the plans for how long the trail will eventually be. So it's one of those, another example of how something gets into writing in law, but you have to keep going at it. And Parks and Trails Council has been one of those voices that is continuing to ask to build more parts of this trail and get it done. All right, so then we come to today, and this is like 58 years later. And we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, 73 state parks, 25 state trails. But it's not a time to rest. There are still more parks and more trails that need to get built and are expanded, and people that need to stand up for them and help keep them protected. So that brings us to our work at Parks and Trails Council today. So we have three main areas that we work in. We do research, we do policy, and we do land acquisition. So I'll tell a little bit about each of those. So our research is designed to support agency staff, as well as informing lawmakers who hold the purse strings about the needs of our system. One of our biggest research projects is our effort to inventory and assign a grade to every segment of paved state trail in Minnesota. So here is our report card from our 2018 data. And the situation has changed a little bit since we put this report card out. And we have since rewritten all of the state trails, and hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have an updated version of this report card. But it gives a really great view to see where do the trails need attention. And it's a reminder to our policymakers that we can't just build the trail and then expect it to take care of itself on its own. Like, it needs money, it needs funding, it needs continual rehabbing and repaving to keep it in good condition. Here is a zoomed in portion of one of the trails. This is the Gateway Browns Creek State Trail. And you can see that we have different segments within the trail. So parts of it might be in excellent condition, other parts can be in very rough condition. And this is really helpful for planners to to understand where they need to prioritize the efforts, the planners from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and also it helps us when we go to the state capitol to talk about the needs. You can actually right now go to our website. On our homepage. There is a link to this. There's an interactive map that shows each of these segments of State Trail that you can click into every individual segment and get data about how it has changed between 2018 and 2023. And you can also click and get a Google Street View of the State Trail. So here's a little preview of what that looks like if you were to click into that segment. So I think this is on the Cuyuna Lake State Trail. So you can essentially click around and, how you would with Google Street View, but on each trail. So you can preview each trail as if you were a rider on the trail. So that's a really popular way to understand our state trail system. All right, and then so we use all of that data, and then we have a overall conditions for all of the state trail. So we have, according to this again is a little outdated, and we hope to have new information by the end of the year. But in 2018, 75% of our state trails were in good condition, 20% were fair, 6% were poor or very poor. So overall, I mean, I think it's a pretty good picture, although you will see in our updated report that everything has shifted just a little bit down. So we're not keeping pace with the needs to maintain it at this level. So we need more funding in order to keep it at this level. And that's just a reminder that that report is coming soon. All right, so we also do policy work. We are a forthright voice at the state capitol, advocating for the needs of state parks and trails in our state. Here is our legislative priorities from this last session. So the session has ended, and we're working on our current agenda for the upcoming session, but that's in development right now. So this is what we were working on last year. So based on all that data that I was just sharing about the state of the trails, we were asking for additional funding to rehab those state trails. We're also looking at a budget for Minnesota's parks and trails that was adequate for keeping up with the needs. We are also really working on this effort to keep state park fees affordable. So there's some voices that have been calling for an increase in the amount of money that it would cost to get an annual or a daily permit to go into the state parks. And our research shows that it's not going to solve the issue in terms of funding for state parks and trails, and that we are going to be presenting a bold new option that's in the works that could be using license plate tab renewals instead of a sticker that you would buy at the park. So keep your eyes peeled for some more information about that as it comes out. We also work on protecting state parks from OHVs and ATVs. So there has been some really strong voices over the past decade that have been advocating for expansion of OHVs and ATVs really across everywhere. But there's also been specifically efforts to introduce them into state parks where they are currently prohibited from being used. So Parks and Trails Council has been a really strong voice advocating that state parks remain protected from OHVs and ATVs. And I would venture to say that if we weren't out there making this case for that, you would be seeing them in the state parks right now. And then finally, we have replacing state park lands. So in 2024, there were 2 state parks that were closed. One, and they were like for very different reasons. One was at Hill Annex Mine State Park, and that was kind of a very unique situation in that when the park was first established, it had a clause in it that said if mining were to become viable again, it used to be a mine, this Hill Annex Mine State Park, and if mining ever became viable again, then it would revert to no longer being a state park and would allow it to be an active mine again. Well, I guess that happened in 2024, and they decided to close it down as a state park and switch it over to an active mine again. I think they're in the works of reactivating it. The other situation was a very different situation. It was at Upper Sioux Agency. I'm sure probably most people know about this situation. It was land. So the Upper Sioux Agency, pretty much since it was established, has been in contention by the Native nation that lives right in that area. And the state decided to transfer the land to that Native community. Parks and Trails Council supported that effort. However, we do think that we should replace that land. So, losing state park land is never a positive, and if there's options for replacement. So we've been working really hard to try to get the legislature to fund a replacement bill. We just this last session we did get a bill authored and a number of lawmakers signing onto it that would create a $20 million fund to begin the effort to look for the replacement lands. It didn't actually pass through the whole legislative process, so we are going to be working on that again in 2026. But I think that it's important to note, so the legacy amendment that we all voted on and overwhelmingly passed is active until 2034. And there was a plan that was established, a Parks and Trails plan related to this legacy amendment that set a goal of trying to create 5 new state parks by the end of the legacy amendment in 2034. And I think that's a really bold and wonderful goal to have because we have more people in the state that need more lands available for recreation, and we have lands that are beautiful and still need protecting. However, as a state, we are actually at a net loss of 1 park currently. So if you take these 2 parks that closed and then we added 1 in the meantime, so a net loss of 1. So we have some making up to do in terms of creating new state parks. All right, so as a council, as an organization, Parks and Trails Council also works on acquiring land for Parks and Trails when it's most needed. So since our founding in 1954, we have added 9,277 acres at 51 different parks and trails. So we acquire this land when it's most needed. And sometimes that is to create an entire state park, which is what we did at Afton State Park. Sometimes it's to create an entire trail, which is what our organization did with the Cannon Valley Trail. And then more often, it is to purchase a small yet invaluable parcel. So this is like what we've done at Tattagouche State Park, where we recently acquired some lakefront land. And I thought I would just kind of highlight a couple examples to illustrate this work. So here's at William O'Brien State Park. We've done 8 different projects at this state park. It's totaled 1,076 acres. And we completed our last project in 2023. Although we're working on potentially adding another parcel maybe by the end of the year. So here is a picture or a map showing what William O'Brien State Park looks like. I'm guessing most, if not all of you, have been to this state park. It is very close to the metro area, just north of Stillwater. And it's a beautiful state park full of, a variety of amenities from being right on the St. Croix River to then also having the beautiful prairie lands and forest all mixed into this one beautiful place. So here's what the map looks like. And then here is what it looks like. If you see the shaded green area, that is land that Parks and Trails Council helped to add to this park. So it's 58% of the park was acquired through the help of Parks and Trails Council. And it's been done over a number of years. The very first acquisition was in 1972. And you can see that that's quite a large, that was our biggest acquisition. That was when the park was expanded to open up and add in the prairie lands into the park. Prior to that, it was just more this day use area. All right, and then let's see, so over here, I wanted to highlight this part on the western border. I'll just share a little story about how that acquisition occurred. So this land was owned by a man who had been born on the land. It was land that his parents had been farmed for generations before him. So this was land that he was very strongly attached to. And he farmed it himself for many years after he was old enough to do so himself. He started to get older and was looking to move into a care facility and move off the land. There, at this time that he was contemplating his move, there was a lot of development happening in the nearby areas, a lot of housing developments being built. And he just really wanted to see the land stay in a more natural state because it's quite beautiful. And even though he wanted to keep it in the state, he was being tempted by some, developers who were offering significant amount of money to buy the land. And then he decided that he would start to sell it off in chunks. So his house was on this main part, but he first sold off this part to the south, which was just farmland, and then to the part to the north. And then finally, where his house was located in the middle, he waited until he was ready to move off the land to sell that part. And at the time, the DNR just didn't have the funds available to buy it from him. And that is the role that Parks and Trails Council often fills, is to buy up land and have the funds available. So we have a revolving fund with a significant amount of money in it that's at the ready so that when a landowner is ready to sell, we are ready with the funds to acquire it for them. And then we hold on to the land until the DNR is then able and ready to buy it from us. So here's some photos of the land. It did have like an old barn on it that we had to remove. And then if you look past the barn, you would see this beautiful pasture. And then there's a photo here down below of one of the buildings being burned. This was a partnership that we had with the local fire department because the building was no longer habitable and we didn't want it for the park. So we partnered with the fire department and they used it as a training for their firefighters to learn how to put out a house fire. And there they are, pretty happy. They successfully brought it down and cleaned it up. And then today it's being restored. It's now been transferred to the state park and they're starting to incorporate it. The plan is to actually eventually get the Gateway State Trail to connect and use this land as it connects into Scandia, which is a project that's in the works. It's probably still a number of years away, but this land was critical for allowing for a corridor for the gateway to connect then into the park. I do have another state park that I'll quickly share. So this is Chattagooch State Park. I'm sure most people have been to Chattagooch State Park as well. And then here are the 9 different projects that we worked on at Chattagooch State Park. And they're much smaller projects, definitely way under half of the acreage of the park. But here it is some really critical pieces. Like down below, there was a number of shoreline pieces that we acquired. That's what this photo is of. It's one of those, it's a pebble beach that we recently acquired for the park. And we're working to slowly get this piece of land here to connect Palisade Head to the rest of the park. And our most recent project was actually completed last year, where we bought this little 25 acres of land at the northern border. It's part of the Baptism River, so it's a beautiful piece of undeveloped land. But it's, as you can see, it straddled the border of the park. So half of the land was in the park border, and then the other half was outside the park. And that was another reason that the DNR couldn't acquire it themselves. It's just they're logistically challenged with logistics about the statutory boundary of a park. So this is one where we got involved, we bought the land, and then we worked on splitting apart the land. We've since transferred these 12.5 acres into the park, and we're working to figure out what to do with this remaining acreage that's outside the park. And then I think that's pretty much all I have to share. I got one other, so if you go to our website, parksandtrails.org, we have a full list of all the different state parks and state trails. I think it's a really nice way to see the system and to see the different stories that we have for all of the different state parks and state trails. I'll look at the questions as I show the video.
Minnesota is home to incredible treasures of the natural world. Through the efforts of the Parks and Trail Council of Minnesota, we are all able to enjoy the pristine beauty of Chattagooch State Park's shoreline, the unique solitude of Blue Mound State Park's endangered prairies, and the critical connections of Gateway State Trail's expansive corridor that connects the city to the country. When we spend time in natural places like these, we feel better, more integrated and harmonious, more in touch with ourselves. And yet, our society is increasingly disconnected from nature. We're spending less time outdoors. The need for parks and trails is greater than ever. In 2011, Minnesotans helped create a bold plan to address this deficit. The Minnesota DNR's Parks and Trails Legacy Plan committed to adding 5 new state parks by 2034. Yet today, we've actually lost more state parks than we've added. We're clearly going in the wrong direction. We need more than plans. We need action. While many of our lawmakers and agency leaders understand this problem, today many are misguidedly funneling money away from parks and trails. Some claim we no longer need to protect more land. Others say parks are too much work, and some are undermining the fundamental role of state parks as natural oases by attempting to allow disruptive motorized all-terrain vehicles. The incredible legacy of natural beauty safeguarded within our parks and trails relies on people in every generation working together to keep them protected. For over 70 years, Minnesotans have looked to Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota to stand up for the places we all love. We step in when most needed, sometimes to create an entire park, like Afton State Park, other times to purchase a small yet invaluable parcel, without which the park or trail would have lost part of what makes it so special.
I can't tell you the tears that came to my eyes when we heard who had won the auction, and I am so grateful to the Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota for securing the Boy Scout camp and the 24.5 acres for the generations to come.
We acquire land that makes a difference by increasing access to nature while also protecting ecosystems. But parks and trails also need public investment and policies that protect these special places. This is why Parks and Trails Council works to give legislative voice to places that have none of their own.
Whether it's purchasing an at-risk acres of land to protect the spirit of a local park, educating lawmakers like myself about the importance of our trail system, or encouraging citizens to become advocates themselves, the Park and Trail Council has an immense impact on our ability to walk out the door or take a short drive and find ourselves on a beautiful trail.
The Parks and Trails Council has certainly been a strong advocate for parks and trails for decades at this point, and certainly my experience is directly related to state trails, where in fact the stamp for state trails right now is in part based on the advocacy of Parks and Trails Council in Minnesota.
The value that the Parks and Trails Council has brought to Glendalough is immeasurable, really, because we embarked on this building program 9 years ago, and we were just kind of searching for direction, and we came to the Parks and Trails Council. They gave us advice. They helped with the legislative work, lobby on our behalf, and without that, we may have gotten it done, but it may have taken a lot longer than 9 years.
We can't do this work without you. Our members and supporters are the backbone and the heart of our operation. We wouldn't know the joy of biking the trail along Lake Superior, of camping under giant pine trees at Itasca, or strolling through the prairie fields of Sibley State Park, and the many other invaluable places we have the joy of knowing. We are a growing community of park and trail enthusiasts, working together to support the places we all love. Together, we are people saving special places.
What areas are being targeted for the 5 new parks? So there are no publicly available information on which parks are being targeted. I think, quite honestly, there's a lack of effort around identifying where these parks could be. And Parks and Trails Council has done a little bit of work in talking with the DNR about potential sites for expansions of state parks. Those talks are happening, but nothing public at this point. All right, so then the question was, you said 2 state parks were lost and 1 was added. What was added? The LaSalle Lake State Recreation Area was added, which is near Itasca State Park. That was added shortly after the Legacy Amendment passed. Yeah, so that was the only addition. It's a beautiful place, though. Is there any trail expansions planned? There are a number of trail expansions being planned. I mentioned the Gateway State Trail expansion that is actually in the works right now. A segment of it is in the works in Scandia. It's not going to quite make it to the William O'Brien State Park for this phase of the plan, but hopefully the next phase of the plan will bring that into the park. I think there's also some expansion that's happening on the Minnesota Valley State Trail. And those are the only 2 that are coming to mind, but there are, I'm sure, other ones as well. State trails are constantly being expanded. I think because a lot of them have been designated and their corridors have been identified over quite large expanses. And most of the state trails have not been finished yet. So the way that the process works is that they get authorized, to go a certain corridor, and then you have to start buying up the land and or developing the pavement. So, all right. What is the new? Oh, wait, no, I think we already said that one. This one is about John A. Latch and when it's going to be open again. And is there any chance in expanding it and putting in camping? I honestly can't answer that one. I'm not familiar. I didn't know that it was closed. That must have been a temporary closing. Does anybody know what that was about?
Well, the steps up to the bluff, basically it's just got steps up to the bluff and they were falling apart, so they've been repairing the steps and it looks like it's still closed. But there's also a lot of that they used to have camping, but they don't anymore. And there's also quite a bit of land away from the bluffs that is not used at all. So it looks like there could be some potential there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll have to keep my eyes open for that. I'm not familiar yet at this point. Okay, next question. Tadagooch, you said that you are working to figure out what to do with the part of the land you bought that's outside the park. Can you just add it to Tadagooch? We tried that. Unfortunately, it didn't take. So the way that state parks are established is that these statutory boundaries are created. And the statutory boundary says where land can be added. This land was outside of that statutory boundary, and it's located in, I believe it's Lake County, which the county, the DNR likes to work with the county to make sure that the county is amenable to adding additional state park land. And at this moment, the county is averse to adding additional lands. So sadly, we're not going to be able to add it there right now. There are times when, as an organization, we have worked to add land that was outside of a statutory boundary, and we worked to change the boundary lines. Like that's what we did at Frontenac State Park, where we added 100 acres. But it was a little bit different situation with a different county. All right. I just want to say that I am disappointed with working against ATVers. We should be working with all outdoor user groups instead of motorized versus silent sports. I'm an off-pavement bike packer and have enjoyed many trips riding on ATVs. My favorite section was Ely to Grand Marais, and that was only possible because the ATV clubs raised money to build a bridge. You know, we're not necessarily against ATVs. There is a lot of land available for ATV use. We are simply saying state parks is just not where they belong. So there's very little land and acreage that's actually set aside as a state park, and land that's, you know, set aside for silent recreation. And we say, let's keep that little bit of land that we have that's set aside for silent recreation and keep it silent. You can continue to do OHV use, you know, in other places. A lot of the state forests allow ATV use, and we have not opposed that. All right. Regarding state trails, would all of the state trails ever be connected? That is a dream. That is part of our vision statement as an organization, is to have this all be interconnected. And that is part of what the legislation for creating these state trails is, that they start to connect into each other. So yeah, we're working on it, and we have that same dream. Okay, Stacy, we are so close to a fully paved bike trail from Itasca to the Twin Cities. I am hopeful someday it will happen. That would be great. And there was part of the effort for Itasca. They just finished a segment of it's called the Itasca Spur of the Heartland State Trail. So they just finished I don't know how many miles it is, but it's going from Itasca State Park out of the park toward Park Rapids, where it's going to connect with the Heartland State Trail. So that's another expansion that's underway. They have the whole corridor mapped up that's going to go from Itasca to connect with the Heartland in Park Rapids. All right, so I noticed that trails like Wobegon and Sioux Line are not on your list. Are they part of some other organization? So those are regional trails. We do most of our work on state trails, although we do work with regional trails as well. So we have partnered with regional trails, and actually, just this year, we actually helped to acquire some land for the Swedish Immigrant Trail, which is a regional trail, paved regional trail that goes from Interstate State Park in towards Chisago County. So we do work with the regional system as well. All right, and then our final question, how do you differ from the Minnesota Land Trust or the Nature Conservancy regarding land acquisition? Well, so we only work for parks and trails acquisitions. I know the Nature Conservancy definitely does land acquisition. I don't know if they've done much, if any, land acquisition in parks and trails, but we do. We have a similar model for how we do it. I think for how we do it with, well, our model is that we have a revolving land fund, so we don't ever actually hold on to the land permanently. We always buy up the land knowing that we're going to turn it over to a public partner. So most likely it's the DNR as a state park or a trail. Sometimes it's to a regional or county entity. But then when we sell the land to the entity, we take the proceeds, put it back into our revolving fund. So these funds are just constantly being used over and over again to buy up land, put it back into public ownership, buy up land, put it back into public ownership. And I think that's the end of the questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. Are there any last minute questions for Lisa? Okay, if not, then I guess thank you so much, Lisa, for being
Yes.
with us and
Thank you for having me.
educating us on the states and trails and what you have been doing for them.
Thanks for watching this Minnesota Rovers presentation. If you want to see more, please click on the link to our channel or the subscribe button below. Thank you.